All right, we are recording. So welcome to Pub Theology. Tonight, what we are going to be doing is taking on the question of how do you resolve the God you find in the Old Testament with the God you find in the New Testament. Now, my guess is that this came up because we in depth a month ago or 2 months ago, maybe, took on Marcionism. And that was the question that got Marcion to be Marcion. For those of you who weren't there, Marcion's a bishop early on in the church, and he eventually comes to the conclusion, as he is one of the first people to ever try to put the Bible together, that you don't need the Old Testament, plus you don't need a whole bunch of other things too, because the Old Testament was silly because that was a different God. It's, by the way, not totally the throwing out of the Old Testament, but the second God thing that really got him in trouble. Had he just said, I don't like the Old Testament, they probably would not have excommunicated the guy. It was his position that there are two gods, a lesser God and a greater God, that really rubbed the early church parents the wrong way. Not big fans of polytheism or docetism, depending on how you want to say that. And, you know, most people at this point don't care. So we're going to hit on that just a little as we go in. To why people ask this question, but I think there's really an ancient version of this and a more modern version that come from two very different places, but it's worth noting both. Cool. So let me go ahead and share my screen and see if I can successfully get us over to my PowerPoint.
Ooh.
I know it's moving.
That's cool. Ooh, 3D.
Very 1980s. Yeah. So there you go. See, I go top dollar for you guys. As always, if I shrink the screen, just yell at me. So if you need to say something. So how to resolve the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament? So first of all, I think the perceived clash that most people perceive is the idea that the New Testament God is about love. The Old Testament God seems like a really judgy sort of a dude. I'm also very okay with killing people. How do you resolve God of love, God of sort of fire and brimstone, right? That's usually sort of in the modern sense what most people are talking about when they sort of talk about this whole problem of God of Old Testament, God of New Testament. Okay. Note, you can probably guess where I'm going with this since I call it a perceived clash. So whenever you get down to this idea that there is a God of the new and God of the old, and there's somehow so different, there's a clash, you're almost always going to come from one of two readings. The ancient misread, which is going to be that the God of the Old Testament is weak and insufficient. This is what Marcion would have said. And the God of the New Testament is perfect. Again, this is best illustrated with Marcion. There are some others who go down this road. Docetism, which I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that there is a lesser and a greater God in the Trinity that have come together in some form. We'll go there too. But basically, that idea is to look at something like the Garden of Eden. In the story of the Garden of Eden, after the eating of the fruit, God appears to Adam and Eve, looks around and asks the question, where are you guys? Right? Well, that implies that God does not know where they are. Right? And so Marcion particularly was really troubled by that because he says, well, but the God of the New Testament's all knowing. This God is like asking people like, where are you? He doesn't even have GPS. How can this be the same God? So for Marcion, he really got stuck again on the idea that the God of the Old Testament didn't know things or needed human help or let humans get involved in magic and stuff. You'll see that with Jacob and others, witches of Endor, these sorts of moments. And so Marcion perceives that as weakness and therefore perceives it as a lesser God. Modern theological readings, however, often pinpoint this idea that the New Testament God is love or promotes love, and the Old Testament God is judgmental or moralistic, or even wrathful. And then that becomes where the clash becomes. Ancient problem, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, like I was saying earlier, it's the all-knowingness of God between the Old and New Testament that gets the ancients mixed up. Frankly, I have anyone who I've actually sat down and talked to about this. This is not where they get stuck. Okay. I've never actually met someone when they say, how do we resolve these gods? They're talking about this clash. Okay. Historically, you find people in this category. Historically, you find people even into the modern era sort of getting stuck on this. But I'll be honest, as a pastor, I've never had anyone who's gotten stuck on this question. This is not why. Fair?
Mhm.
Modern question. So in the modern era, I think one of the things we need to acknowledge off the bat, and feel free to challenge me on this, is that modern Christian theology is dominated currently and has been for the last hundreds of years. And you could probably argue even longer than that, but since we're using the word modern, I'm going to limit us to the last few hundred years, by cis, straight, white, male, urban, educated individuals, primarily from the United States and Western Europe. Okay. There are statistics. We can look at number of books written. If you take the number of books written by this group versus everybody who's not this group has written more books. Okay. Therefore, if we understand theology as all contextual, in other words, everyone, when they speak of theology, and I think this is an important thing that I want you guys to take away with this, whenever we speak of theology, whether or not it's me or you or a grand, brilliant theologian, all of us always talk from our perspective, right? Because all of us are limited human beings, no matter how smart we are. And we are trying to describe something that is beyond who we are, right? Because none of us are God. And so even by the mere fact we are taking this divine experience we have had, or experience of the divine that we've had, and boil it into our own language, we're reducing it, right? Like neither you nor me nor anyone can fully describe God. And so because we have to reduce it for ourselves, even if it's just linguistical, we are going to bring our own context, our own language, our own descriptions, our own biases forward when we speak about it. Okay. Therefore, I think it's very important that we make sure that we keep an eye towards who is speaking and an eye towards what bias they are going to bring, if any, in a particular question in theology. Because I don't think there's a way to eliminate bias completely, not the way you can in physics or chemistry or anything like that. Because you can't repeat an experiment when it comes to God. You can come up with a doctrine, an idea, a concept, you maybe get consensus, but that's not science. That's something else, not bad, and it's the best we can do, but it's not chemistry. You follow what I'm trying to get at? Okay. And so we always got to approach with a certain level of humility and self-awareness, hopefully. And I think it is this bias that the general theological community generally holds that leads us to the misread that most of us have been taught. Because when you leave this very specific but very loud group in theology, you don't have the clash between the New Testament and Old Testament. If you go read queer theologians, you don't have a clash. You go read womanist, which is Black women theology, or theology from a Black female perspective, you don't have a clash. Or Black male perspective, or Hispanic, or feminist, or any of these other perspectives, you don't have a clash. It is if you understand this group to be just as contextual as those groups, this group seems to get stuck here. The problem is that they have most of the bullhorns. And so we are used to hearing and being taught that there's a clash. So just keep that in mind, and I'm going to try to break this down a little bit more. By the way, Judaism or people who are outside of Christianity who study the New and the Old Testament, because you have a lot of scholars who are maybe atheists or whatever, you don't find the clash as much either. I'm going to get to why. So first of all, that group I was listing, and guys, whether, we can argue whether or not I qualify living in Sheboygan as urban, but I'm talking about my tribe, my tribe that I'm a member of, right or wrong, right? Okay, so I'm doing internal tribe kicking here. The ultimate intersectionality of privilege exists with this group, right? All those things I listed are all things of privilege, right, wrong, or whatever it is. And with that privilege, I think brings a bias.
See, when we look at the law gospel dynamic, okay, and when we talk about Lutherans, law is the things you ought to or should do, okay, rules mostly, but ethics is all a form of laws. And gospel is the understanding of forgiveness and love and caring and those sorts of things, which are also things we should do too, right? Okay. This dynamic between the two, this idea of forgiveness and justice is a through line in the Bible. But if you have lots of privilege, justice, you get not from the act of justice, but the act of your privilege, right? I, as a white man, when I get pulled over, if I was to get pulled over by the cops, don't really have to worry all that much unless I was doing something wrong. That's not true for everybody, right? But that's my privilege. Okay. That's what we mean when we speak of like racial privilege. But I have gender privilege and so on and so forth too. And so does most of the folks who are writing this. Okay, let me go back. So I think what often happens is when justice is brought, this group feels the consequence heavier, the freedom lesser. But when forgiveness is brought, this group feels the freedom more than forgiveness being withheld. And we'll get into why. Okay. I'll give you an example I'm trying to get at. Okay. I'm going to give an example of what I mean when I say that what ties the two together is probably liberation. Okay. What ties together the New and the Old Testament is this sort of idea of liberation. So I'm going to take one through line through the Bible for a moment of how we could recast a whole slew of things which has been cast in a weird place. Okay. Or cast in what I think is a biased place. So let's jump to Genesis. Genesis 3. This is the curses, right? So they've eaten the apple or the mango. I always like to think of it as mangoes because mangoes are delicious. And they've gotten in trouble. God has caught them. They get up there and God starts giving a list of curses, right? Childbearing is going to be painful. Snakes, you're going to bite people and that's going to have venom. And by the way, you snake, the people's children are going to stomp on your head. Like God is just giving out the curses. One of the curses in Genesis 3 says, woman, you shall cleave to man, and man shall rule over you. Okay. Now that has been used by this group of folks earlier who have dominated theology to say, hey, women, that means you're inferior. See, God said so. But let's stop for a second. It's a series of curses. So saying that we should enforce the curse is like saying that we shouldn't engage in agricultural science because God gave us a curse of starvation. 2 lines later, he said it would be hard to go ahead and pull food from the earth. Okay, that's insane. Or saying hey, snakes are venomous. They should bite your legs. Saying we should, because God made this curse, enforce it would be like saying we should all grab snakes and have them bite us repeatedly because God gave us that curse. Right? It doesn't really make sense. And yet theologians for generations interpreted it that way. But what happens if that curse means we should be fighting against patriarchy as strongly as we fight against starvation? And as much as we as Christianity rightfully and truthfully go out and try to feed the world, maybe we should try to liberate the world from patriarchy too, with just as much fervor. Because it's just as much of a curse. Okay. Now, if you were to continue reading, this group historically then goes to Sodom and Gomorrah and says, it's about homosexuality. But when you read Sodom and Gomorrah, it's not. And anyone who wants to debate with me that later, we can do that. We'll read through it together. But it is about sexual assault and rape. Because that's what the gangs of Sodom and Gomorrah want. They are rape gangs. So maybe Sodom and Gomorrah gets destroyed because they commit sexual assault and rape. The book of Job. Again, this group would traditionally say, well, Job is about suffering like him. Sometimes God calls you to suffer and you should just suffer. Okay, now this is very bad news for women because that's been used to tell women, put up with it and just suffer. But if you read the book of Job, an interesting thing pops out. You have 2 women in the book of Job. Okay. Chapter 4. Job, things are just going bad for Job. He goes to his wife. He says, honey, basically, things are getting horrible. I think God has cursed me. And she tells him, if you think God has cursed you, go to God, fall on your knees and say, God, strike me down. You have cursed me. Just kill me already. Anyone notice that if he had actually done that, the book would have ended? Because the deal between the devil and God at the beginning of the book was, if Job came and rebuked you, we would stop the bet. Meaning, had he listened to his wife in chapter 4, there wouldn't be 20 chapters of Job. All the suffering that occurred would have stopped had he listened to his wife. But of course he doesn't. He basically calls her stupid and says, what does a woman have to teach me? And then goes to the bar, talks to all his friends for the next 18 chapters. And then the Holy Spirit comes down in feminine form. It's very clear in the Hebrew. Tells him, go to God, bring this to God. Stop going to your idiot friends at the bar. They're no help to you. Go bring this to God. And if you do, God will surely hear you. And he sort of listens and goes, well, that makes a lot of sense, but you're a woman and I'll listen to women. And then he says, hey, my friend has a student. He's really smart. I should talk to him, which causes like 4 more chapters of like boils for the poor guy. So maybe the lesson from Job isn't just suffer for suffering's sake because suffering is noble. Maybe the lesson is listen to your wife. Or there's a danger in not listening to diversity. Because he decided not to listen to women because he said women were stupid. He says it very blatantly in chapter 4. And because of his ignoring of the women who show up, he suffers for a very long time, honestly, needlessly. Syrophoenician woman. Jesus is walking around up to the point in which he meets the Syrophoenician woman in the Gospels. Jesus refers to himself as here to save the people of Israel. It's very specific. I'm here to save the Israelite people. And like that is a very defined group, right? Okay. He meets her. She's Syrophoenician, so she's not as Israelite. She says, you should save me too. He says, I'm not here. I'm not going to throw the crumbs of what the children give. Or I'm not going to throw the food from the children to the dog. So he calls her a dog, and you can inference what word he's really using if you call a woman a dog. Okay. She turns back and she argues with him and says the dogs get to eat the crumbs. And if you're God, your crumbs still save us. And from that point on in the Gospels, he stops saying that I'm here to save the people of Israel. He says, I'm here to save everybody. Which would mean and could be interpreted not as him testing her faith, which again is what this group of folks initially and for very many years took that to mean. What happens if she taught him something? What happens if in that conversation, Jesus realized because he's fully human, he was wrong. And he did what Job didn't do, which was actually listen. And maybe the lesson for us is we should listen to, even to those who are different. Now, you can hit a lot of other things in the Bible. I could do this all day with scripture. But now you have a theme of gender equality, right? You could easily run an entire theme on that. And yet, brilliant men from this particular group stared at the scriptures for hundreds of years. And this very simple interpretation didn't get the light of day until you got female writers who said, hey, this is jumping out on the page like crazy to me. Anyone notice the 2 people that Job could have talked to were both women? Maybe you should talk. Maybe your wife has something to say that's smarter than your, friends at the bar. Now, let's look at this theme that we just talked about for a moment, this theme of gender equality. Now, you can buy it or not buy it. All these, like I said, everyone brings their own thing to one of these, okay? Which is why I like to expose folks to lots of different viewpoints. But let's just for a moment say you're a professor who's cis, straight, white, male, urban, educated individual who's from the United States or Western Europe. And this becomes the predominant way your university is going to look at the scriptures. So they're going to really promote gender equality as part of what they feel is a calling as a Christian. I think if we're really honest, the rules derived from a theme like that are far more likely to correct the behavior of that group of professors than they are to correct the behaviors of others towards those professors, right? You guys follow what I'm trying to say there? So if you're a cis straight white man and we start treating women equally, more likely someone's going to say, dude, you can't say that.
Yeah.
Or you can't do that. That's not okay. Then someone coming and saying, dude, people can't talk to cis straight white men like that. That's not fair for gender equality. Why? Because you already had privilege to start with, and you could use the privilege to be treated however you wanted. No? Therefore, what we find is a dynamic, and this is why we're getting to this. We find a dynamic where this group is willing to deconstruct something like Job, right? So me going to a modern theological class at a mainline Protestant university could totally say the Job thing, point to a whole crew of scholars. Folks would say, yeah, I like it, or no, I don't, but it's academically valid, okay? And you would have very little trouble at most universities actually making the Job argument. However, the second you go from talking about the Job thing to, I don't know, enforcing the Job thing, and anyone who's ever worked in higher education knows there's a huge difference from working on a statement of what the professors or faculty believe and working on like a code of conduct. Because you get to the code of conduct world and people get really mad really fast, especially if it has any teeth, right? Okay. Much easier to pass non-binding unfunded resolutions all day. Why? Because all of a sudden they're like, man, if we really promote gender equality, there's a chunk of us that maybe don't deserve the jobs we have because we're pretty mediocre here. I might be in that. I'm not sure I want the competition, right? This is why, even though that in the United States, you get a doctorate in most foreign countries, even very prestigious universities, it won't be recognized in the United States. And I'm just picking on academics because we're talking specifically about the theologians' writings, okay? But you can see this in other fields too, right? There's this resistance. And I think this is where the mirage I talked about earlier comes from. The mirage obscures the actual link between the Old Testament and New Testament. See, I think the link looks like this. God liberated enslaved Israelites by getting them out of Egypt. God then liberated the Israelites from the internal oppression that they had learned in Egypt. That, by the way, would be my, if I had to give a synopsis of Genesis Exodus, that's it. Then God sent Jesus to liberate us from death, the devil, and sin. Then God sent the apostles and others to help spread the message of liberation of both spiritual and physical liberation to the rest of the world. And I'd say that's what you find in Acts of the Apostles and the epistles, things like that. It's all talking about that sort of thing. It's worth noting this line of liberation, South American liberation theologians, that's why they call themselves liberation theologians. But Black theologians would have argued this for generations. Womanist theologians would have argued this for generations. Queer theology would argue this. You can go through all the other groups that have labels given to them. They would argue this. In fact, most of Christianity would argue this. Now, even evangelicals would say it's liberation. Now, their understanding of liberation and your womanist understanding of liberation is going to be different than your feminist understanding, which is going to be different than your queer understanding, so on and so forth. But even your hardened evangelical 700 Club Pat Robertson dude would say absolutely it's about liberation. Okay. Why? Because he's going to represent a group slightly different than that. Okay. See, the gospel liberates us by reminding us that we are loved, we are forgiven, we are reclaimed, especially when we fall to despair, because we do things we know we shouldn't do. But the law liberates us too, by helping us create a more just world, a more civilized world, where we are not completely trapped by the whims of those who are well off and well connected. Because in anarchy, that is the group that wins, right? Without law, without some sense of order, the group that wins is going to be the group who are wealthy. If you don't believe me, go and look at any country throughout any part of history on any continent. And when it implodes, those who are well off and well connected just simply do what they want. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that our theologians, because it's dominated by a particular viewpoint, will get very much about trying to say love, 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 love. And they're not wrong. God is very much about love, but that's really half the equation. But it's the half of the equation that those who have a lot of power really want to hear, because they have a lot that needs forgiving. So forgiveness is felt deeply. Justice, on the other hand, is a much harder thing to swallow if you are the person in power, because most likely what you are told is what you're doing isn't okay. To quote a good friend of mine who went on to be a Black theologian, forgiveness, love, and the abolishment of hell is great news to the plantation owner. It is horrible news to the slave, if by that there is never justice, freedom, or liberation. So I would argue, when you read the Bible, read it for its liberation. Read it for its ways in which it makes you more free, both spiritually and emotionally, but does it through finding justice and equality and love and compassion, because both the law and the gospel are equally important. Thoughts, ideas, questions, rebuttals. Matthew, you've lost your mind. Whatever you're thinking. You guys are super quiet for this one.
It's just a lot of absorbing of what you've said. I mean, I've done other Bible studies, but it's, like I said, from a white male perspective.
Mhm.
And I always wondered why I couldn't get it, or why everyone else was so thrilled about what they were hearing, but I felt dejected and upset because it doesn't seem like what I'm reading coincided with what I'm seeing and what I thought Jesus wanted from us.
Mhm.
It just seems like when I was hanging out with them, they always took this one direction of justice that, to me, wasn't any kind of justice at all.
Mhm.
So when I heard your sermon today and when you were talking about this, it helps me understand better what the author was trying to inform me and write about. I mean, I did a class on Job
Mhm.
for when I went to school.
Yeah.
And my understanding from what he was trying to teach me was that she was just a nagging wife.
Mm.
The idea of a liberation or a gender equality of, well, if you had just done what she has told you to do, your suffering would have ended.
Mhm.
So I kind of want to read it again
Right?
to see it from your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I highly promote that. I always tell people, like, read the Bible. Like, just do it. And if you have questions, ask questions, because, like, I find that a lot of folks, and I know you're not one of them, okay? But I know a lot of folks who when they read the Bible, they just read a lot of memes. And that's not the Bible. You know, and we send out the memes too, and they can be inspirational, but when you really just start at the beginning and work your way through, it's tough, it's rough. But there is so much in there that the average person, even the average person who goes to church every week, has never really heard. Which is
Right.
why I'm doing the book club Bible study, which I know you've attended a number of those.
Mhm.
You
And
know
it's
that I'm
helpful.
just as radical at book club Bible stories I am being tonight.
Right. And it's helping me better understand what is written, because like in our last church, it made it more magical than it actually happened.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but
No.
I'm really getting tired of going to Bible studies or reading books about the Bible and feel like Harry Potter is just waiting in the wings to come out and just go Aviosa or whatever. I don't know.
Right,
It's
right.
like, what the hey?
Yeah. No, I
It
hear
just
you.
it just doesn't seem real when they talk about it.
Well, you're getting more of a three-dimensional look at it. Even if this isn't the only viewpoint or the right viewpoint, you're getting light on the same thing you've seen over and over your whole life, I think is what you're saying.
Mhm.
And it
Yeah.
brings dimension to it, and you can appreciate it in a new way. It's like experiencing anything through a new lens. It's, hearing a song you've known your whole life, performed in a different arrangement, whatever it might be, and you can appreciate it in a slightly different way now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And for me, the whole goal of theology is really spirituality, and the whole goal of spirituality is to figure out how me, Matt Hacker, the unique weirdo that I am, connect to the divine, and keep switching lenses until I figure out what works for me, with the knowledge that that might not work for you, Joe, and that's okay, because we're connecting to the same divine.
A couple other things that came to mind while you were going through that, which, yeah, same. I was quiet. I was absorbing a lot of it. I remember hearing or seeing, it's probably a meme, when you're privileged and you experience equality, it feels a whole lot like oppression. I mean, that stood out to me, kind of getting at some of the themes you were getting at.
Mhm.
And something he said at the end, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but when the world implodes, the wealthy carry on business as usual, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, they might have to modify their business, but yeah.
Yeah. Holy cow, did that feel, I don't know, got a little guilt shock there with the whole COVID-19 situation. Like, I am fortunate that my world, yeah, different, but not rocked in the way that so many less fortunate people have had their worlds just turned upside down.
Absolutely. Or the fact that the height of the COVID thing, if you were a white collar worker, in most cases, this statistically, okay, and I can back this up with labor statistics. If you were a white collar worker when you started it, you're very likely to not lose your job. You were very likely to be able to work from home. And you were very likely to therefore afford grocery delivery and all sorts of things that did make you safer. If you worked on the line building something, or you worked in a store, okay, you work at Walmart, you work a place like that, a lot of folks lost their job, and you either did your job with bravery and courage to get up and go out there, or you were fired.
Yeah.
And so you had people having to go, I have no daycare, but I gotta go to work, and I'm gonna have to expose myself. And this is also true, by the way, of healthcare workers. Some of those are doctors, or definitely white collar, so it doesn't perfectly match. But I think those inequities were quickly seen. And even in how vaccines got out, who got them when, and things like that. But even jumping out of our own country for a second, if you look at a place that imploded like Somalia, if you were a rich merchant when Somalia implodes, you mostly are now just a strongman. And you have a zone of Somalia of some piece that you control with the army you bought with the money you had. So yeah, no, I agree. This is why I promote everyone to come to my Bible studies. I really do bring up new ideas.
I think Joe brought up a good point, though. I mean,
Yeah.
for so long, a lot of popular press or rhetoric on Facebook, social media, it always talks about the extremes of who have and have not. And COVID, the year kind of threw it's more like a twist on it, because the haves still had, the have-nots really had not. And then within the middle, there's a twist of some have, some have and actually had it better because costs went down. You weren't commuting, you weren't the car sat in the garage for 6-9 months, and your grocery bill was cheaper than what it would have been going out every Friday night. So you pocketed more. And I hadn't thought about the folks who, you kept your job, but you lost the daycare. You kept your job, but you lost the support mechanism. So now you had to find something to compensate for actually a very big gap. And depending on what that gap was, whether it was a little person or an elderly person that needed care, but those are substantial. And they're the often invisible parts of our neighbor's existence that we don't think about in the equation.
The invisible infrastructure.
Yeah.
Well, we know that during the height of the COVID pandemic, and things have gotten slightly better and new numbers will come out, but like the participation rate for women in the economy hit a low that we had not seen since like the late 1950s, early 1960s, somewhere in there. Because families sat down and said, well, dad makes more, which there's a whole history as to how that ended up happening, right? So it only makes logic that mom quits her job because we've lost daycare, and you can't just like leave the 1-year-old by themselves in a room. That's not an option, because we're loving parents. Or mom, because it hit both ends. So it hit people, young kids, but also hit people who had elderly parents at home, because someone's got to stay home if the home health care aid can't get in.
And we're going to see an evaluation of, do elderly move into a home care situation, or do you go to what my family was used to as the extended families? Grandma moves in with.
And unfortunately, that's just not an option for everybody, for any number of reasons, often way beyond the control of the person who is elderly.
Boo. I don't know.
We are all like so quiet. I didn't mean to like bring us all down with heavy things.
There's so many things we've had an opportunity to talk about, and so many things that you can pleasantly in a year and a half ago, it was if you get up, you go to work, you come home, you have dinner, you go to bed. It's just the cycle and the cycle. You keep going and going, and there were times you didn't take the time out to think about what's happening as a result of this loop that I run all the time. The first parts of COVID, when everybody was working from home and comparing notes and everybody jumped on Zoom, it was, what's changed for you? you know, what my was and my is.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became what your standard, because after 6-9 months, it's your habit. And now we're getting ready to break out of the habit. And what part do we take with us? And in that time, did we observe, will we remember seeing that the ribbon twisted, that people who needed more help need more help, just because we can all leave the house now and go someplace and maybe we don't have to wear a mask all the time. People still need help.
We got terrible memories. I'm sure we'll
I
forget.
know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Within 3 months, we'll be back to, I just go on my loop. I go.
I forget a bunch of stuff, but then when I hang out with my friends on Facebook from high school and stuff, they quickly remind me of a lot of the things that reminds me why Gen Xers are known as people who really don't freak out about everything. We're kind of chill. And it's because we do remind each other, yeah, we've seen this before. When I won't specifically name names. I don't want to bring up finger pointing, but let's say a politician brings up the fact that, oh, this famous performer is bringing back more bad moral values, and we need to fight the culture war and all that stuff. That has been going on from the 1950s with Elvis, from Madonna to numerous other famous
Shock
people.
of the generation.
Yeah. It's like it just keeps coming back and forth. So it's like with what's going on with COVID. We're all freaking out about it, but this has happened before. But at this stage, we weren't as well cooperative as we were before, like the polio vaccine. And I mean, Boy Scouts, everyone chipped in to try to get a cure for polio, and it's pretty much eradicated in the United States alone.
Well, and
I think we just completely forgot that this is how we do deal with this kind of catastrophe.
That's how March of Dimes got started.
Yeah.
March of Dimes was collecting dimes to buy polio vaccines to give to everyone in an attempt to get rid of polio. The reason they went on to doing other things is because they succeeded.
Right. And unfortunately, with so much misinformation, non-trusting, people taking advantage of others, we completely forget how easy it was for us to defeat polio. I mean, we didn't say, oh, polio will just come and go, we don't have to worry about it. No, it was devastating.
When I served in Nebraska is one of the last states in the United States to actually eradicate polio. And so if you look at like breakouts, historically, like major breakouts, polio, Nebraska is one of the last states which has a series of very bad breakouts. So I actually had a handful of folks in my congregation who were alive during some of those breakouts. And they would talk, it was just horrific, unbelievable fear and all that. But you're absolutely right that the response to the horror, the response to the fear wasn't run around in circles and scream. It was, all right, we're under attack as from this thing, as a community, what can we do?
Right.
But it was also a different time. And I also, again, as a person who likes history, it's worth noting, you're right, we have been through these before and we've had good scenarios like how we reacted to polio. We also had bad scenarios. Like one of the reasons the 1918 flu was so bad is a lot of the mistakes we made this time, we made then.
I kind of disagree in that
That's right.
The flu that went around it was different because they didn't know what they were fighting, per se. We had an idea this was a virus with COVID. Back then, they thought flu was a bacterial infection, and they fought it like that. The idea that it was an RNA strand that was getting people sick in that regard didn't happen until it was just recently discovered that I was Watson Crick, and I can't remember her name. I want to beat myself over it. Discovered that RNA, that the virus, well, that we had DNA, but this virus was RNA. That's how it became so deadly for us.
Absolutely. And I mean, from the scientific perspective, you are absolutely right. Very, very different response. I was more speaking to the Spanish flu, as it was called, probably started in Kansas.
Right. I've never understood why they called it the Spanish flu.
Because they blamed it on Spain.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
it really is just like they
Spain
blamed it on
wasn't
Spain
involved in
because
the
Spain
war,
was
and-
foolish enough to be one of the few countries, because it was a neutral country, to actually report the amount of deaths by flu and not just count it as war casualties, which is how most of how it got counted by the military. Was like, oh, we lost 100,000 people, from different things. Some of them were
Okay.
shot, some of them other things happened.
Spain reported
Which
all
covered
as
up a lot of the
Spain
numbers,
as
at least
flu.
early on. What?
Okay.
Spain
'cause-
reported them all as flu.
Right. Spain reported every flu as flu. So they come out with this, it looks huge numbers, but the reality is, from folks who've studied this, that it was pretty widespread by the time Spain is giving these huge numbers. And when you trace like the genetics and all this stuff, their best guess is Kansas. But
Wow.
right. And there was soldiers coming through Kansas that picked it up and took it to Europe.
Okay.
Is this one of the major guesses? The other thing I was sort of referring to is early on, especially if you're talking like the mid-Atlantic, you look at like Philadelphia, though it's also true in places like I think St. Louis. They quickly cancel a lot of things early on because they know that it's contagious. You're right. They don't really know how or why, but they know that the larger group of people get together and one person's sick, a lot of people are sick within a few days.
Right.
Like they know that. You have canceling, and then you have wariness come in. And then you have groups that are like, well, I'm going to do it anyways. And so you have, again, I forget if it's St. Louis or Philadelphia, but one of them goes against the wills of like everybody and has a giant parade, and it becomes a super spreader event, or what we would call super spreader event.
Right.
I want to say Philadelphia, but I may be wrong on that. That's what I mean with like we've repeated some of these things. But we're going down like all sorts of trails, but that's always fun. But I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording because I think we'll have more fun going down more trails if I'm not recording. How does that sound? Can we call it cool for the recording? All right.
There you go.